Ace Frehley stumbled into the dressing room 3 hours late, his silver makeup already half applied and smeared across his face like a grotesque mask. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped the bottle he'd been carrying, vodka spreading across the concrete floor in a clear, accusing puddle. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley were waiting for him, sitting in chairs they'd positioned to block the door. This wasn't a band meeting. This was an intervention. And everyone in that room knew that what happened in the next hour would either save Ace Frehley's life or end Kiss forever. It was March 15, 1981, at the Forum in Los Angeles. Kiss was supposed to go on stage in 20 minutes. 18,000 fans were already in their seats, already screaming, already expecting the greatest rock show on earth. But the greatest rock show on earth was currently falling apart in a backstage dressing room, watching their lead guitarist try to remember how to stand up straight. Gene looked at Paul. Paul looked at the tour manager hovering anxiously near the door. Nobody wanted to say what they were all thinking. Ace Frehley was dying right in front of them, and they'd been pretending not to notice for almost 2 years. But 2 years ago, everyone had seen the signs. They'd just chosen to ignore them because acknowledging them would mean confronting something none of them wanted to face. The truth was that Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx, the shy kid who'd found his voice through a guitar, had disappeared somewhere inside the character of Ace Frehley, the Space Ace, the cosmic guitar hero. And whoever was left inside that silver makeup and leather costume was drowning. Ace had always been the quiet one in Kiss. While Gene built his demon persona into a marketing empire and Paul worked the crowd with his starchild charisma, Ace had been content to stand in his corner of the stage and let his guitar do the talking. He'd created the Space Ace character almost reluctantly, agreeing to the silver makeup and the cosmic theme because the band needed him to, not because he'd wanted to become a character. In the early years, it had been fun. The makeup had felt like armor, protection from the overwhelming attention that came with being in the biggest band in the world. Paul Daniel Frehley could hide behind Space Ace, could be whoever the audience needed him to be while keeping his real self safe and separate. But somewhere along the way, the line between Paul and Ace had started to blur. And then it had disappeared entirely. The pressure had started building in 1979, during the Dynasty Tour. Kiss was everywhere. They weren't just a band anymore, they were a phenomenon. Action figures, lunchboxes, comic books, a television movie that had drawn record ratings. Everywhere Ace went, people expected Space Ace. They wanted the character, the persona, the silver-faced guitar god who breathed smoke and played with cosmic power. Nobody wanted to meet Paul Frehley. Nobody cared about the guy from the Bronx who just wanted to play guitar. So Ace had started drinking more. Just a little at first, just enough to quiet the anxiety that came with putting on the makeup every night, with looking in the mirror and seeing a stranger staring back. Just enough to make it easier to be Space Ace instead of Paul. Just enough to stop caring that he didn't know which one he was anymore. The first time Gene had found Ace passed out in his hotel room, it had been after a show in Detroit. Ace had been celebrating, Gene had told himself. The show had been great, the crowd had been electric, and rock stars drank. That was normal. That was expected. Gene had helped Ace to bed, made sure he was sleeping on his side, and hadn't mentioned it again. The second time had been in Boston, before a show instead of after. Ace had been in his dressing room, bottle in hand, makeup half done, eyes unfocused. Paul had found him that time. They'd gotten him cleaned up, gotten him on stage, and he'd played the show. Not perfectly, but well enough that most of the audience hadn't noticed anything wrong. The band had noticed, though. They'd noticed the missed cues, the sloppy solos, the way Ace had stood too still between songs like he was concentrating just on staying upright. After that show, Paul had pulled Gene aside. "We need to talk to him," Paul had said. "This is getting worse." "He's just going through something," Gene had replied, because acknowledging the truth felt too dangerous. "He'll work it out." But Ace hadn't worked it out. He'd gotten worse. By late 1980, Ace was showing up to recording sessions drunk. He'd play takes that were unusable, solos that wandered and lost their way, rhythms that couldn't keep time. The rest of the band would have to stay late, working around him, re-recording parts after he'd left or passed out in the corner. The album that should have taken 2 months to record was stretching into 6, then 8. The producer, Eddie Kramer, a man who'd worked with Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin, who'd seen his share of rock and roll excess, had finally pulled Gene and Paul aside and said something nobody wanted to hear: Ace needs help. Professional help. Or he's not going to make it. But Kiss had a tour scheduled. They had commitments, contracts, 18,000 people buying tickets in every city. They couldn't cancel. They couldn't admit weakness. So they'd done what rock bands had been doing since rock bands began: they'd convinced themselves it would be fine. Ace would pull it together. He always did. They'd make it through the tour, and then they'd deal with it. The tour had been a nightmare. Ace had missed sound checks, shown up late to shows, forgotten lyrics to his own songs. In Philadelphia, he'd fallen off the drum riser mid-song. The audience had thought it was part of the show, but the band had known better. In Chicago, he'd played an entire solo with his guitar out of tune and hadn't seemed to notice. In Cleveland, he hadn't shown up at all. Gene had had to tell 18,000 people that Ace was sick, food poisoning, nothing serious, while backstage Paul had been on the phone with their tour manager, trying to locate their missing guitarist. They'd found him 6 hours later in a bar 3 blocks from the venue, so drunk he couldn't remember the name of the city he was in. That's when Paul had made a decision. After Cleveland, after watching fans leave the venue disappointed, after lying to 18,000 people, after realizing that one of his best friends was actively dying and he'd been enabling it by staying silent, Paul had had enough. He'd told Gene, "We're doing this. Tomorrow. We're confronting him. I don't care if he quits. I don't care if it ends the band. I'd rather have no Kiss than watch Ace kill himself." Gene had resisted at first. Gene Simmons, the businessman, the strategist, the man who'd built Kiss into an empire, didn't want to risk everything they'd worked for. But Paul had been insistent, and eventually Gene had agreed. Not because it was good for the band, but because deep down, underneath all the makeup and marketing and merchandise, Gene Simmons loved Ace Frehley. Not as the Space Ace, not as the lead guitarist of Kiss, but as Paul, his friend, the shy kid from the Bronx who joined their band in 1973 and helped make them into something neither Gene nor Paul could have built alone. So they'd planned it. The Forum in Los Angeles, March 15, before the show. They'd told their tour manager to make sure Ace came to the venue early. They'd told the crew to set up the dressing room with chairs blocking the door. They'd prepared what they were going to say, rehearsed it like they rehearsed their shows. They were going to save Ace's life. Or they were going to lose him trying. Ace had arrived 3 hours late instead of early. He'd been drinking since that morning, maybe since the night before. He'd shown up with makeup already started, the silver smeared and uneven, his hands shaking too badly to finish the job properly. And when he'd walked into that dressing room and seen Gene and Paul sitting there, chairs blocking the exit, their expressions serious and sad and determined, he'd known immediately what was happening. "Not this," Ace had said, his words slurring. "Not tonight. We have a show." "Sit down, Ace," Gene had said, his voice gentle in a way his demon persona never was. "I said we have a show." Ace had turned toward the door, but Paul had stood up, physically blocking him. "The show can wait," Paul had said. "You can't." And that's when the confrontation had really started. The intervention they'd been avoiding for 2 years, the conversation nobody had wanted to have, the truth that had been growing and festering and threatening to destroy everything. "You're killing yourself," Gene had said, direct as always. "And we've been watching it happen. That's on us. But it stops tonight." "I'm fine," Ace had insisted, still trying to get past Paul, still trying to run from this moment. "You're not fine," Paul had said, and his voice had cracked with emotion. You fell off the drum riser in Philadelphia. You forgot the words to Shock Me, your own song, in Chicago. You didn't show up in Cleveland. Ace, you're not fine. You're dying. So what? Ace had shot back, and there had been real anger in his voice now, anger mixed with something else. Fear. So I have a few drinks before shows. So what? Half the bands in rock and roll are drunk on stage. It's part of the lifestyle. This isn't lifestyle, Gene had said. This is suicide. And we're not going to watch it happen anymore. That's when Ace had done what Gene and Paul had feared he might do. He'd laughed. Not a happy laugh, not the laugh of someone who found the situation funny. A bitter, broken laugh that sounded like glass breaking. You don't get it, Ace had said. None of you get it. Then explain it to us, Paul had pleaded. Ace had sat down then, not in the chair they'd left for him but on the floor, his back against the wall, still clutching that smeared makeup sponge. His hands were shaking so badly the silver grease paint was falling in small flakes onto his leather pants. Every night, Ace had started, his voice quiet now, every single night, I put on this makeup. And every night, I look in the mirror, and I don't recognize the person looking back. Is that Ace? Is that Paul? I don't know anymore. I put on the costume, I strap on the guitar, I walk on that stage, and for 2 hours I'm Space Ace. I'm the cosmic guitar hero. I'm the character. And then the show ends, and I take off the makeup, and you know what? I still don't recognize the person in the mirror. Because I don't know who I am when I'm not being the character. Gene and Paul had been silent, listening. This was more than Ace had said about his feelings in years, maybe ever. So I drink, Ace had continued, because when I drink, it doesn't matter who I am. It doesn't matter if I'm Ace or Paul or nobody. When I drink, I don't have to think about it. I don't have to look in the mirror and wonder which face is real. Paul had knelt down beside Ace on the floor. The real face is Paul, he'd said. Paul Frehley. The kid from the Bronx who plays guitar better than anyone I've ever met. That's who you are. But nobody wants Paul, Ace had said, and there had been such pain in his voice that Paul had felt it physically, like a punch to his chest. The fans want Space Ace. You and Gene want Space Ace. The record company wants Space Ace. Nobody gives a damn about Paul Frehley. So why should I? Because we do, Gene had said, sitting down on Ace's other side. Paul and I, we care about Paul Frehley. The guy who showed up to our audition in 1973 and played us into Next Week. The guy who wrote Shock Me and 2000 Man and half the best guitar parts Kiss has ever recorded. The guy who makes stupid jokes on the tour bus and falls asleep first on every flight. That guy. We care about that guy. Ace had looked at Gene, then at Paul, his eyes red-rimmed and full of tears. He was trying not to cry. Then why does it feel like he's disappearing? Why does it feel like I'm losing him? Because you're trying to drown him, Paul had said. Every time you drink, you're pushing Paul further away. And eventually, if you keep doing this, Paul's going to be gone completely. There will only be the addiction. Not Ace, not Paul. Just the bottle. That had broken something in Ace. The tears he'd been holding back had started falling, mixing with the silver makeup, creating streaks down his face that looked like war paint or wounds. His whole body had started shaking, not just his hands now but all of him, trembling with fear and shame and the beginning of understanding. I don't know how to stop, he'd admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I've tried. I wake up every morning and tell myself today's going to be different. Today I'm not going to drink. And then noon comes, and I'm already 3 drinks in, and I don't even remember deciding to start. It's like I'm watching someone else do it. Like I'm not in control anymore. You're not in control, Gene had said. That's what addiction is. It takes control from you. But you can get it back. We can help you get it back. How? Ace had asked, and he'd sounded like a child, lost and scared and desperate for someone to tell him what to do. Rehab, Paul had said. A treatment facility. 30 days, maybe more. Professional help. People who know how to deal with this, who can help you get sober and stay sober. Ace had shaken his head immediately. We have a tour. We have shows scheduled. I can't just disappear for 30 days. We'll cancel the tour, Gene had said, and even he had sounded surprised by his own words. Gene Simmons, who'd never cancelled a show, who'd played with a fever of 103, who'd told the band that the show must always go on no matter what, was saying they'd cancel the tour. You can't cancel the tour, Ace had protested. The fans, the money, the contracts. None of that matters if you're dead, Paul had interrupted. Don't you get it? You're more important than Kiss. Paul Frehley is more important than Space Ace or any character or any show. We'd rather have you alive and unemployed than dead and famous. And then Ace had said something that changed everything. 7 words that would alter the trajectory of his life and Kiss's future. I don't want to die, he'd said. Please help me. The show that night had been cancelled. Gene had walked on stage and told 18,000 disappointed fans that due to a medical emergency, they couldn't perform. Refunds would be issued. They were sorry. The crowd had booed, angry at having their Saturday night ruined. They'd felt cheated, ripped off, denied the spectacle they'd paid for. But backstage, in that dressing room, Paul Daniel Frehley had made the most important decision of his life. He'd agreed to go to rehab. Not tomorrow or next week or after they finished the tour. That night. Gene had made calls, used connections, pulled strings. By midnight, Ace was in a car heading to a treatment facility in Malibu, the silver makeup still streaked across his face because he'd been shaking too badly to wash it off properly. The first 30 days were hell. Not the poetic, metaphorical hell of rock lyrics, but actual, physical, torturous hell. Withdrawal from alcohol, especially after years of heavy drinking, is dangerous. It can kill you. Ace's body, so dependent on alcohol that it had stopped functioning normally without it, went into shock. The shaking got worse before it got better. Ace couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, could barely stand. He hallucinated, seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices in empty rooms. His heart raced at random moments, pounding so hard he thought it might explode. He sweated through sheets, through mattresses, soaking everything around him with the toxins his body was desperately trying to expel. The counselors at the facility told him this was normal, that everyone going through withdrawal experienced these symptoms. That knowledge didn't make it easier. For 3 days, Ace thought he was going to die. For 3 days, he wanted to die, because dying seemed preferable to feeling the way he felt. On the 4th day, his body started to stabilize. The shaking lessened. He managed to eat some soup, keep it down. He slept for 14 hours straight, the first real sleep he'd had in years that hadn't been alcohol-induced unconsciousness. On the 5th day, he started therapy. Real therapy, not the kind where you sit on a couch and talk about your mother. Intensive, confrontational therapy designed to break through the walls that addicts build around themselves. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen who'd been working with musicians and entertainers for 20 years, didn't let Ace hide behind jokes or deflections. Why do you drink? She'd asked him on that first session. Because I'm a rock star, Ace had answered, trying to be flippant. It's what we do. No, Dr. Chen had said firmly. That's what you think people expect. Why do you drink? Ace had tried other answers. Because it's fun. Because it helps me perform. Because I'm in a high-pressure situation and it relieves stress. Dr. Chen had rejected all of them, pushing, probing, refusing to let him off easy. Finally, after 40 minutes of verbal sparring, Ace had told her the truth. The same truth he'd told Jean and Paul in that dressing room. Because I don't know who I am anymore. And when I drink, I don't have to figure it out. So the alcohol is an escape, Dr. Chen had said. From identity crisis. From the pressure of being a character. From the disconnect between Paul Frehley and Space Ace. Yes, Ace had admitted. Here's what you need to understand, Dr. Chen had said, leaning forward. The alcohol isn't solving that problem. It's making it worse. Every time you drink to avoid dealing with your identity crisis, you push your real self further away. You reinforce the idea that Paul isn't strong enough to handle the pressure, that Paul needs to be hidden, that Paul is weak. The alcohol isn't an escape from the problem. The alcohol is the problem. Over the next weeks, Dr. Chen had worked with Ace on rebuilding his sense of self, separating the character from the person, learning to be Paul Frehley who happens to play the role of Space Ace rather than Space Ace who used to be Paul Frehley. It was subtle but crucial difference. The character was a costume he could put on and take off. The alcohol had made the costume permanent, made him forget how to take it off at all. Jean and Paul had visited every weekend, driving the hour from Los Angeles to Malibu to sit with Ace in the facility's visiting room. They'd brought him guitar magazines, letters from fans who were rooting for his recovery once news had leaked about his rehab stint, encouragement from people who loved him not as Space Ace but as a human being who was fighting to survive. Peter Criss, the drummer, came too. Peter, who'd left Kiss in 1980 partly because of his own struggles with substance abuse, sat with Ace and shared his own story. I left because I couldn't get clean while I was in the band, Peter had told him. The pressure, the lifestyle, everything about it was pushing me toward the bottle. But you're stronger than I was. You're staying and fighting. I admire that. After 45 days, longer than the originally planned 30 because the doctors wanted to make sure Ace was truly stable, Paul Frehley walked out of that facility sober for the first time in years. He weighed 15 pounds less than when he'd gone in. His skin looked different, clearer, younger somehow. His hands didn't shake anymore. But the biggest change was in his eyes. The defeated, lost look was gone. There was clarity there now. Focus. Determination. Kiss didn't immediately go back on tour. Instead, they went back to the studio. The album they'd been struggling to finish for months, The Elder, needed work. But this time, when Ace walked into the studio, he was present. Really present. Not drunk, not high, not hiding behind anything. Just Paul Frehley with his guitar, ready to work. The first solo he recorded sober was for a song called The Oath. Eddie Kramer, the producer who'd seen Ace at his worst, watched him nail the take in one pass. Perfect timing, perfect tone, perfect execution. When Ace came into the control room to listen to the playback, Eddie had tears in his eyes. That, Eddie had said, is the real Ace Frehley. Welcome back. But sobriety wasn't easy. Every day was a choice. Every day, Ace had to actively decide not to drink. The cravings didn't disappear after 45 days in rehab. They persisted, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes subtle, but always there. He attended AA meetings, not because they made him comfortable, they didn't, but because they worked. He called his sponsor when the cravings got bad. He avoided bars, avoided situations where alcohol would be present, avoided old friends who didn't understand or support his sobriety. The first sober show was terrifying. Phoenix, Arizona, 3 months after leaving rehab. Ace had stood backstage, hands steady but heart racing, wondering if he could do this. Could he be Space Ace without alcohol to blur the lines? Could he put on the makeup and still know he was Paul underneath? He'd looked at Jean and Paul, both of them watching him with concern and hope in equal measure. "You've got this," Paul Stanley had said. "Paul's got this." And he did. That night in Phoenix, Ace Frehley played the best show he'd played in years. The solos were tight, the timing was perfect, the performance was everything it should have been. When he walked off stage, he'd felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride. Not in Space Ace, but in Paul Frehley. Pride in staying sober. Pride in overcoming. Pride in surviving. But Kiss's dynamics had changed irreversibly. The intervention, the cancelled tour dates, the time in rehab, all of it had created fractures that wouldn't fully heal. By 1982, creative differences and personal tensions led to Ace leaving the band. But unlike Peter's departure, which had been messy and bitter, Ace's exit was clean. He left sober, healthy, and with his friendships with Gene and Paul intact. His solo career in the 1980s had its ups and downs. There were moments when the cravings came back strong, moments when staying sober felt impossible. But Ace had learned in rehab that recovery wasn't about never struggling. It was about not giving up when you struggled. Every time he felt the pull toward drinking, he remembered that dressing room at the Forum, remembered Gene and Paul sitting beside him on the floor, remembered his own words: "I don't want to die. Please help me." In 1996, when Kiss reunited for their massive reunion tour with the original lineup, Ace returned to the band. But he returned as Paul Frehley, playing the character of Space Ace, not as someone who'd lost himself in the role. During the first rehearsal, when he'd put on the silver makeup for the first time in over a decade, he'd looked at himself in the mirror and seen clearly. That was Paul wearing a costume. And when the show was over and the makeup came off, Paul would still be there. Today, Ace Frehley is in his 70s. He's been sober for decades, though he'll tell anyone who asks that sobriety is a daily commitment, not a permanent state. He's written books about his experiences, been open about his addiction and recovery in ways that few rock stars of his generation have been willing to be. He's mentored young musicians struggling with substance abuse, showing up at rehab facilities to talk to patients, sharing his story, proving that recovery is possible. In interviews, when asked about the intervention at the Forum in 1981, Ace is always grateful. "Gene and Paul saved my life," he says. "They risked our friendship, risked the band, risked everything to force me to face what I was doing to myself. A lot of people don't have friends like that. A lot of people don't get that wake-up call. I'm one of the lucky ones." Gene and Paul, when asked about the same moment, express no regrets. "We did what friends do," Gene says. "We intervened when intervention was needed. If we'd lost Ace as a band member but saved him as a person, that would have been worth it." Paul Stanley, always the emotional heart of Kiss, is more direct. "That night, we stopped being a band for a few hours and started being what we should have been all along, brothers. Ace needed help, and we gave it to him. That's not heroic. That's just human decency. I only wish we'd done it sooner." The silver makeup that once felt like a trap to Ace now feels like art. The character of Space Ace, which almost killed Paul Frehley, is now something Paul controls rather than something that controls him. He can put it on and take it off, can be the cosmic guitar hero when he's on stage and Paul from the Bronx when he's not. The line between the two is clear now, defined, healthy. At a 2019 concert, during a rare solo show, Ace had paused between songs and shared something personal with the audience. "I want to tell you something," he'd said, his voice rough with emotion. "There was a time in my life when I thought I had to be someone else to be valuable. When I thought the real me wasn't enough. I nearly died believing that lie. But I learned something important: the character, the makeup, the costume, none of that matters. What matters is the person underneath. And if you're struggling with addiction, if you're trying to escape yourself through substances, I want you to know something. You're enough. The real you is enough. And asking for help isn't weakness. It's the bravest thing you can do." The crowd had erupted in applause, but Ace hadn't been playing to the crowd. He'd been speaking to that one person in the audience who needed to hear it, the way Gene and Paul had spoken to him in that dressing room 40 years ago. The way someone had spoken to them about confronting Ace. The way recovery works, one person helping another, one story inspiring another, one life saved encouraging someone else to save theirs. Ace Frehley's story isn't unique. Thousands of musicians have struggled with addiction. Hundreds have died from it. But Ace's story has a different ending because two friends loved him enough to intervene, and because Ace loved himself enough, finally, to accept that intervention and do the hard work of recovery. The Space Ace character still exists. Ace still performs, still plays that smoking Les Paul, still wears the silver makeup and the platform boots. But now, when the show ends and the makeup comes off, Paul Frehley looks in the mirror and knows exactly who he's seeing. Not a character. Not an escape. Not a stranger. Just himself. Sober, healthy, grateful to be alive. That's the real legacy of March 15, 1981. Not the cancelled show or the disappointed fans or the gossip about rehab. The legacy is that Paul Frehley survived. He got sober, stayed sober, and built a life where he could be both the rock star and the real person without losing either one. And in doing so, he showed countless others that recovery is possible, that asking for help is strength, that the real you, whoever that is underneath the costume, is worth fighting for. If this story resonated with you, if you or someone you love is struggling with addiction, know that help exists. Recovery is possible. You're not alone. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're fighting to stay sober today, Ace Frehley and everyone who's walked this path before you is proud of you. Keep fighting. You're worth it.